Why does a mother's heart still jump when her son's name lights up on the phone, even after everything he's done? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. Even now, sitting here at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold, I still don't have a clean answer. What I do have is a story. And I think some of you, maybe more of you than I'd like to believe, will recognize pieces of it in your own life. My name is June. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a postal clerk in a mid-sized town in Ohio. Nothing glamorous. I sorted mail, I helped people fill out forms, I knew half the town by their P.O. box number. It was honest work, and I was proud of it. I raised my son Curtis on that salary after his father left, when Curtis was 4. Just the two of us in a 3-bedroom house that was slightly too big and slightly too cold every January. But it was ours. I want to be careful here not to spend too long on the past because I know how these stories go. You start talking about all you sacrificed and it starts to sound like a list. Like you're building a case. I'm not building a case. I'm just giving you enough so that what happened later makes sense. Curtis was a bright kid. Curious, quick, a little too charming for his own good sometimes. He got a partial scholarship to Ohio State, and I covered the rest, about $14,000 over 4 years, out of my savings, and a small personal loan I paid off quietly over 3 years, without telling him how much it strained things. He graduated with a business degree and got a job at a logistics company in Columbus. I was so proud I cried in the parking lot after the ceremony. He laughed at me for that. Not meanly. At least, I didn't think so then. He moved to Columbus. That was fine. That's what kids do. We talked every Sunday. He came home for Thanksgiving and most Christmases. It was normal, good even. Then he met Vanessa. I want to be fair to Vanessa. I don't know her well enough to dislike her specifically. What I can say is that from the first time Curtis brought her home, about 2.5 years ago, something shifted. She was polite to me the way people are polite to someone they're tolerating. Careful. Measured. Her eyes moved around my house the way you look at something you're trying not to judge out loud. She came from money, or at least her family presented themselves that way. Her father, Gerald, was supposedly in commercial real estate in the Cleveland area. Her mother, Pamela, wore the kind of jewelry that makes you feel underdressed, just sitting across from it. I told myself I was being insecure. Small-town postal worker meeting big city money. Of course I felt out of place. I tried harder. I cooked her favorite meal the second time she visited. Curtis had mentioned she liked shrimp pasta, and she ate about 4 bites and said she was watching her carbs. I smiled and passed the bread basket and told myself it was fine. The Sunday calls got shorter, then less frequent. Curtis started texting instead. Short ones. All good, mum. Busy week. Talk soon. I told myself he was just settling into a relationship, that this was normal, that I shouldn't crowd him. About 1.5 years ago, he called to tell me they were engaged. I said congratulations and I meant it. I asked when they were thinking of having the wedding, and he said probably that fall, that Vanessa's family had a lot of opinions about venues and they were still working it out. He said he'd keep me posted. He did not keep me posted. Months went by. I asked once, gently, if there was a date set yet. He said they were still finalizing details. I asked if I could help with anything. I wasn't offering money. I was offering to address envelopes, to make calls, whatever a mother could do. He said Vanessa's mother had it covered. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Vanessa's mother had it covered. Then, on a Thursday evening in October, my neighbor Ruthie mentioned, in the most offhand way, the way people mention things they assume you already know, that she'd seen Curtis's engagement announcement in a shared Facebook group, and that it looked like the wedding had already happened. She said, "Oh, it looked beautiful, June. That venue in Westlake." I sat with that for a moment. "When?" I asked. She looked uncomfortable. "I think last Saturday. I went home and I sat in my kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. My son had gotten married the previous Saturday. It was now Thursday. He had not called me. He had not texted. He had not mentioned it, not in any of the brief, polished, nothing messages he'd been sending me for months. I did not call him that night. I needed to think. I needed to be calm enough to speak without my voice doing something I'd regret. I called him the next morning, Friday. He answered on the third ring, and his voice had that slightly too casual tone people use when they know they owe you something. I said, "I heard you got married last weekend." There was a pause. Not long, but enough. He said, Yeah, Mom. We did, I said. I didn't know the date had been set. He said, We kept it pretty small. I said, Curtis, I'm your mother. And then he said, And I want to make sure I get this exactly right because I have replayed it in my head so many times. He said, Mom, Vanessa's family is very prominent in their community. The guest list had to reflect that. It wasn't personal. It wasn't personal. It wasn't personal. I asked him to explain what that meant. He said that Gerald and Pamela had certain expectations about the type of event they were hosting, that they were paying for a significant portion of it, and that the guest list needed to be people who fit within the social context they were creating. He said it in that smooth, almost corporate way he'd developed in Columbus, like he was managing a difficult client call. I asked him directly, Did you not invite me to your wedding because your in-laws didn't think I was the right kind of person? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I knew you'd make it about this. I hung up. I'm not proud of the weeks that followed. I wasn't eating well. I was going through the motions at work. I'd already retired by then, actually, so I was just going through the motions of my days, which somehow felt worse. I called my sister, Wanda, and cried on the phone for an hour. She was furious on my behalf. I called my oldest friend, Patty, and before anyone asks, no, these are not women who tell me what I want to hear. They are women who have told me hard truths for 40 years. And Patty said something that stuck with me. She said, June, you spent 30 years pouring into that boy. You don't owe anyone a single drop more. I thought about that a lot. I wasn't okay, but I was getting steadier. I was starting to understand, slowly and painfully, that the relationship I thought I had with my son was not the relationship that actually existed. That's a grief that doesn't come all at once. It comes in waves, usually in the evening, usually when something small triggers it. Seeing a young man at the grocery store who's about Curtis's age, or finding an old photo tucked in a drawer. Then, 6 weeks after I found out about the wedding, my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. Curtis, I answered. He said, Hey, Mom, like nothing had happened. Like 6 weeks of silence was just a scheduling conflict. I said, Hello, Curtis. He said everything was going well. Asked how I was doing, made about 90 seconds of small talk that felt like a legal document. Then he said, Mom, I actually need to talk to you about something. I waited. He said that there was an outstanding balance from the wedding. He explained that Gerald and Pamela had organized and fronted much of the cost with the understanding that they would be reimbursed, but that some vendors had billed later than expected, and a few costs had run over what was originally budgeted. He said the total remaining balance that needed to be settled was $42,000. I said, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? He repeated it. $42,000. He said he knew it was a lot, but that he'd looked at my finances. I don't know how, I don't know what he thought he knew, and he believed I could manage a portion of it, maybe 30,000, and that he would figure out the rest somehow. He said Gerald and Pamela were getting impatient and it was creating tension. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because it's important. It wasn't rage, not at first. It was something quieter and colder. It was the sensation of something clicking into place, like a door closing, not slamming, just closing. I let him finish. He kept talking, adding context, explaining the vendors, mentioning something about a florist and a catering bill that had come in higher than quoted. I let him talk until he ran out of words. Then I said, Curtis, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. I was not invited to your wedding. I was told, more or less directly, that I was not the right kind of person to be included. The people who were included, Gerald and Pamela's prominent community, are now unable to pay their own bills. And your solution is to call me. He said, Mom, it's not like that, I said. Let me finish. I have been very patient and very quiet for 6 weeks. I'm going to finish. He was quiet. I said, I worked for 31 years at a job I was proud of, but that did not make me wealthy. I raised you alone. I paid for college. I drove you to every practice, every school event, every friend's house you needed to be at. I did all of that because I loved you, not because I was auditioning for anything. But I was not important enough to be invited to watch you get married. I wasn't prominent enough. I didn't fit the social context. I paused. Then I said, So I'm afraid I don't fit the financial context either. The people who deserve to celebrate with you can figure out how to pay for the celebration. He started to speak, and I said, I love you, Curtis. I genuinely do, but I'm not going to do this. And I hung up. Now, I need to tell you what happened after, because some of you might be wondering. He called back twice that evening. I didn't answer. He texted, Mom, please just talk to me. I didn't respond that night. 2 days later, he called again and I answered. And he tried a different approach. Quieter, more emotional, said he knew he'd hurt me. And he was sorry that Vanessa's parents had pressured him and he'd made a bad decision and he'd made a bad decision and he'd regretted it. He cried a little. Or at least his voice did the thing. Voices do when they're trying to sound like crying. I want to be honest with you here, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve a tidy story. Part of me wanted to believe him. That part of me is 67 years old and has loved Curtis since before he could hold his own head up. That part doesn't go away just because he hurt you. But I also noticed something. In the apology, which was real enough in some ways, he still asked about the money. Not directly, not the full amount, but there it was, tucked into the end of the conversation. Maybe just a little help, even a loan, just to get through this rough patch. I told him I needed time to think. I told him I meant what I said about loving him, and I told him that the answer about the money was still no. What I did do in the weeks after was talk to a financial advisor about putting some of my assets into a trust. Not because I'm worried Curtis would do anything dramatic, but because I realized I had been operating without a clear plan, and that needed to change. I also updated my will, which I should have done years ago regardless of any of this. Patty said I should have done it at 55. She was right. I also, and this is the part I want to be clear about, started doing things I had quietly put off for years because I was always focused on what Curtis might need. I signed up for a ceramics class at the community center, something I had wanted to do since I retired. I started going back to church regularly, which I had let slide. I had lunch with Wanda twice in 1 month, which hadn't happened in years. I bought myself a small, completely impractical number of houseplants, and I've killed 2 of them already, and I don't even regret it. My son and I are in a complicated place. He calls occasionally. I answer occasionally. We are not estranged in the way that word sounds. We're not enemies. There hasn't been a dramatic scene or a final severing. But something has changed, and I think we both know it, and I think the change is permanent in at least some of its dimensions. He is learning, slowly and somewhat painfully, that I am not a resource to be accessed, that I am a person who was owed more than she got. What I want to say to anyone watching this, because I know some of you are in versions of this story, maybe as the parent, maybe as the child who did the hurting and is now wondering if it's too late to fix it, is this: you cannot keep withdrawing from an account you never deposited into. That's not a relationship. That's an arrangement. And the moment the other person realizes the difference, something shifts in them that no apology can fully reverse. As for Gerald and Pamela and their $42,000 catering bill, I truly hope they work it out. I genuinely do. I just hope they work it out with their own money. I'm June. I'm 67 years old. I have 2 dying houseplants and a ceramics class on Wednesday mornings and coffee that goes cold while I sit at my kitchen table thinking about things I can't change and things I still can. And I am, for the first time in a long time, exactly where I want to be. I've thought a lot about what I would tell someone who's in the middle of what I went through. Not after, in the middle of it, when you still don't know how it ends, when you're still answering the phone every time his name comes up, because some part of you believes this call will be the different one. Here's the honest thing I've landed on. What happened between Curtis and me didn't start the day he called asking for $42,000. It started much earlier, in all the small moments I chose to overlook, because overlooking felt like love. Every time I made excuses for a short text, every time I told myself Vanessa's coldness was just shyness, every time I swallowed something that hurt because I didn't want to be the difficult mother, I was not being kind. I was being afraid, and I dressed that fear up in the language of patience and unconditional love until I couldn't tell the difference anymore. That's not a criticism of myself. I understand why I did it. When you spend 30 years being someone's whole world, you will do almost anything to stay in their orbit, even when that orbit has shifted away from you completely. But I think the most important thing I've learned is that there is a difference between love that strengthens a person and love that simply enables them to take more than they give. I gave Curtis the first kind for a long time. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I started giving him the second kind, and he stopped being able to tell the difference either. What broke the pattern wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't that I finally got fed up and snapped. It was something quieter, a moment of clarity, sitting in my dark kitchen on a Thursday night, understanding that the story I had been telling myself about my son and our relationship was not the story that was actually happening. That kind of clarity is not comfortable, but it is useful. Choosing not to pay that bill was not a punishment. It was the first honest thing I had done in a long time. It was me finally saying out loud, to myself as much as to him, that I am a person, not a function, that my value is not measured in what I can cover or absorb or quietly endure. Curtis is going to have to learn, in whatever way he learns it, that the people who love you are not infinitely elastic, that there are consequences to treating someone like a resource rather than a human being. I don't know what his life looks like in 5 years. I don't know if he figures this out or if he doesn't. What I know is that I can't figure it out for him. I tried that already. I tried it for 30 years. The ceramics class and the overgrown houseplants and the lunches with Wanda. Those aren't consolation prizes. They are what my life actually looks like when I stop organizing it entirely around someone else's needs. If you are sitting somewhere watching this and you recognize yourself in the story, as the mother, as the son, as either one, I hope you hear this. The account always balances eventually, not as punishment, just as consequence. What you put in is what holds. What you take without returning eventually runs out. That's not a judgment. That's just how it works.